All right, now that we've wrapped up those main concepts, we can take a look at the individual positions of the operating section of the income statement in a little more detail. If we start out with an operating section that's based on the nature of expense method, we see immediately that the first position consists of the revenues, which are sometimes also called turnover. Sometimes you'll see sales as well, but that's not as common as revenues or turnover. These are all translations for Umsatzerlöse. Then the next position is the change in inventory stock, which, as we just talked about before, is usually an income position, can also be an expense position, though it refers to the increase or decrease of inventory in our warehouse from the beginning to the end of the year. The third position is also an income position that we talked about before. The capitalized internal expenses must always be an income position. And then we're left with any other operating income that a company generates. And as examples, the Austrian Company Code lists the income from the sale of fixed assets, which are the Erträge aus dem Abgang vom Anlagevermögen, and the income from the reversal of provisions, which are the Erträge aus der Auflösung von Rückstellungen. This brings us to our expenses. And the first major position consists of the material expenses, die Materialaufwendungen. The second one there, cost of services, which is a translation for Aufwendungen für bezogene Leistungen, refers to any expenses that a company has because it uses the services of another company or natural person. So if I pay a consulting company for a consulting service, then I list the expenses in this position. The next set of expenses are grouped together as personnel expenses, and they're among the most important in an income statement. One important language element, it's a very common mistake. Remember not to pronounce die Personalaufwendungen in English the way you do in German. They're pronounced personnel expenses. The emphasis is on the last syllable, and it's an E at the end, not an A. They're personnel expenses. And they can be subdivided into wages and salaries. Then we have the severance expenses, the pension expenses, and finally the social security expenses. This brings us to our last major expense item in the nature of expense presentation method, which is depreciation and amortization. Now, both of these words are translations for the German word Abschreibung, but depreciation is commonly used when you're talking about the value decrease of property, plant, and equipment, while amortization is used when we talk about the value decrease of intangible assets or financial assets. If you use depreciation in all three cases, it's no big deal. I'm just concerned that if you see the word amortization somewhere passively, then you know what it means. Any expense that was not listed in the above items is summarized under other operating expenses, and if we tally up the results of all these positions, we're left with the operating profit, which is das Betriebsergebnis in German. Now, if we compare that to the operating section based on the cost of sales method, we immediately see that the cost of sales method is a lot shorter. Yay. It consists of the turnover or revenues again, and then the next position is an expense position. It's the cost of goods sold, usually abbreviated as CGS. It's not uncommon at all to read accounting literature where it's just listed as CGS or sometimes as COGS. That all means cost of goods sold and is the translation for the German Herstellungskosten der abgesetzten Leistung. Service companies don't sell goods, so they will sometimes call this position cost of revenues instead. That's completely acceptable as well. Deducting the cost of goods sold from the revenues leaves us with the gross profit on sales, which is the English translation for Bruttoergebnis von Umsatz, and it's quite important because it's used for a lot of metrics or ratios, so it's used for a lot of Kennzahlen. The next position is identical to the other operating income we already talked about, so I'll skip that and move straight on to the administrative expenses, which, as we said in class, is a translation for Verwaltungsaufwendungen. And then we have the selling and distribution expenses, which is a translation for Vertriebsaufwendungen or Vertriebskosten. In each case, remember that they, like the cost of goods sold, consist of all the material expenses, personnel expenses, and depreciation that were relevant in that particular cost center or for that particular function. We have other operating expenses, which are also based on cost centers here, and that leaves us with an operating profit, which, as we've now said numerous times, is identical to the operating profit that we find under the nature of expense method. So that brings us back to this overview. We see that the operating section is usually the most important and largest section of a company's income statement. The finance section is a lot simpler. It consists of financial income and financial expenses. You're welcome to call that finance income and finance expenses as well, whatever you prefer. And each of these is further subdivided depending on whether the income or the expense is a result of interest. So we have interest income and interest expenses, Zinserträge und Zinsaufwendungen. Then in case we earn dividends, for example, because we invested in a company, in a subsidiary, for example, we would have investment income, and any reduction in the value of our stock, for example, would be an investment expense. Das sind Beteiligungserträge und Beteiligungsaufwendungen. And then, in case we have any form of foreign currency, we might earn currency exchange gains at the end of a business year, or we might incur currency exchange losses if the exchange rate develops negatively. Das sind Wechselkursgewinne und Wechselkursverluste. At the end, we're left with a financial result. Das ist das Finanzergebnis. Now, if we add the operating result and the financial result, then we have what we call the ordinary result. In German, that's called das Ergebnis der gewöhnlichen Geschäftstätigkeit. And that leaves us with the extraordinary section. The extraordinary section is not subdivided into anything more than extraordinary income and extraordinary expenses, because these are positions that are not supposed to be recurring. They're very unusual. And if we stay with the previous example of a factory burning down, then we might receive extraordinary income in the form of insurance payments. But on the other hand, we'd have extraordinary expenses due to the destruction of our factory. That tallied up leads to an extraordinary result, and if we add the ordinary result with the extraordinary result, then we arrive at the gross income, which is also called result before income taxes or gross profit, and in German ist das Ergebnis vor Einkommensteuern, Ergebnis vor Steuern aus Einkommen und Ertrag. If we're a partnership, we now deduct the income tax. If we're a corporation, we would have to deduct the corporate tax. And this leaves us with our net annual income or net annual profit, which is the Jahresüberschuss or Jahresfehlbetrag in German. And the remainder of what we see in the income statement is really just a matter of cosmetics, because we can increase or decrease this net annual profit by doing a few things. First of all, we could reverse reserves. If we reverse capital reserves or profit reserves, then that would artificially increase the net annual profit, which would allow us to distribute more dividends to the shareholders later. On the other hand, we might decide that we want to distribute a lower profit and allocate profit reserves and set these aside. So those are two things we can do. We then add any retained earnings from previous business years, also Gewinn- und Verlustvorträge, any profits or losses from previous business years that we haven't allocated to the reserves yet but haven't distributed yet either. And through that, we finally arrive at our balance sheet profit or loss, also Bilanzgewinn or Bilanzverlust, which is exactly the position that we once again find in the equity position of our balance sheet.